Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the garage. What we've got here today is a 2007 Honda Odyssey Touring equipped with a J35A7 engine that has developed a kind of annoying oil leak that kind of looks like a rear main seal leak because it's actually leaving small little drops on the ground. But when I was underneath the vehicle, that I'm not really interested in replacing a rear main seal, but I did discover that the valve cover gaskets were leaking in this vehicle. So we're gonna go and replace those first to see if that rectifies the oil leak issue. Here is our motor. It's of course obscured by a whole bunch of different little pieces. We're gonna start off by moving our cover here so that we can gain access to what's underneath. Now, on this motor, we're going to have to remove a series of different components. The front valve cover is super easy to do because once you take this top intake plenum off, which can be undone by taking all these screws off to expose the cover and then undoing the various 12mm bolts underneath it, that this whole thing can actually lift right off and out of the way, which then gives you free access to the covers both on the front and the back. Now, of course, there's going to be some wiring harnesses and hoses that need to come out, so bear with me. I'm filming this on my own, so I will do my best to capture what I can. Okay. First order of business, safety first. Always disconnect the negative terminal off of the battery because you'll be disconnecting a bunch of electrical connectors and you don't want to have a short under the hood to damage things. Next, I'm going to undo the air cleaner box by undoing the various 8mm bolts that hold the cover on. Disconnect this intake air sensor and then remove a series of hoses and loosen this clamp to remove this whole air box out of the way. And we can now start disconnecting the connectors off of the throttle body. Once those are removed, we can undo the various nuts and bolts on the throttle body. They're 12mm. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to separate the throttle body away from the intake plenum. Make sure that you have a replacement throttle body gasket. All right, so a whole bunch of hoses and connectors removed. Disconnected the intake air temperature, EGR if you wish, just so you don't strain the wiring harness. There's also the coolant temperature sensor down in there that you can disconnect if you want. I believe this is a MAP sensor on the top, throttle body. We've also got our evaporative emissions. There's actually 2 bolts holding this little solenoid. Disconnected that spool valve, which is down here, and then remove the brake booster vacuum hose. Okay, so with that done, we can very carefully slide the throttle body off of the intake plenum. Now, you don't need to disconnect the hoses on the bottom of the throttle body. Those are coolant hoses. You just need to get the throttle body off the plenum so that it can just lift out without disturbing any of those lines that contain a bunch of liquid in them. Okay, so just carefully tuck that out of the way. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to undo all these 10mm bolts and nut on the top of the intake plenum cover. Screws just on this inner top cover. They're all undone, so carefully. Using a screwdriver or a rubber mallet, you can tap the top, or you can use a screwdriver and just carefully pry against this little wing very gently to break that seal open. You lift it off, just make sure that no debris falls down into the intake. Oh, I should mention that you should also unplug the intake vane control solenoid as well, since it's connected to this. So very carefully lift that cover right off the intake. Now with the intake exposed, we're going to undo a series of 12mm bolts down in here and nuts. So I've removed the bolt, and I forgot to mention that there's also this little side valve cover breather hose that has to come off. I took it off on the valve cover side because the valve cover's got to come off later anyways. So the only nuts and bolts you're taking off here are the 12mm headed ones. So there's a nut here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts, and then another nut here. Don't touch these little 10mm ones. So that's what that looks like with the upper intake manifold removed. We can very carefully now lift out this reusable gasket off of the intake plenum. Now I say reusable because the guys at Honda actually reuse this all the time. I've done several of these jobs in the past and I've never had to replace this, but I will give this a good shot with some brake cleaner to make sure it's nice and clean, and then making sure that I keep the orientation in the same way when I put it back in. Now the next step is to take some tape and cover up all those holes so that we don't inadvertently drop something down into the engine. With the intake manifold sealed off with 3 rows of, I think, 2-inch wide painter's tape, we can now go ahead and undo the spark plug coils by undoing the 10mm nuts holding them on, disconnecting them from the wiring harness, and then also loosening or removing the wiring harness, I guess, retainer bracket from the top of the valve cover. And you're going to have to repeat the same for the back, which is unfortunately quite obscured. All right, so the back valve cover is definitely a little more awkward because you can't really see what you're doing, but I managed to get the 3 coil packs out, and a normal ratchet does fit in there quite easily. But this top wiring harness has a bolt on the far right, or driver's side actually, and then there's one just right in here, and you undo them, and that's what they look like, just a little 10mm bolt that holds this whole wiring harness. Now the problem is that there's a whole bunch of other little things that are still kind of preventing this from coming up such that you can take this valve cover off easily. Namely that you've got our 3 fuel injector connectors with the wire retaining clip that have to come out, and best way to take them out is to use a little clip removal pick like this to get under this little wire retaining clip so you don't break them. Get those off. We have to undo this grounding wire, right? And then you'll see that this wiring harness actually wraps down into the V channel of the engine and then back up, which really means that this is not going to come up unless we undo the securing bolt holding this harness holder in, which means that the power steering pump's got to come off, which means the belt's got to come off. Now the other thing I forgot to mention when I was undoing the front valve cover is that while I undid all the connectors, that of course this connector has to lift up, and you can't do so, or at least you can't go up this way over the engine, because the little alternator sort of sensing 4-pin connector is hooked up. So I undid the little retaining screw down here that holds this harness in place, unclipped it from the timing cover, and then unplugged it, and then now you can see that this will actually fold up and over the motor once we have access to remove the retaining bolt that holds that down. So I'm not sure if you guys can see how to undo the serpentine belt, but it's really important to make the orientation, or note the orientation of the drive belt, so that you remember the belt routing. But I'm using this nifty tool. It's made by Gear Wrench. It's a serpentine tool. 19mm socket fits perfectly on that little wing down there. And then to undo the belt, we're just going to apply some pressure this way, right? That applies steady pressure, and then that will push against the hydraulic tensioner, which will then release the belt and allowing you to slip it off the power steering pump pulley. And that's what the belt looks like taken off. So the next thing we're going to do is take off the 12mm bolt right here that holds the pump to essentially the engine block. And then there's another one kind of tucked in underneath that. It's really hard to see, but it's also a 12mm bolt. Undo both of those. So with the power steering pump out of the way, undo that lone 10mm bolt that's holding this wiring harness down in that V channel. Now with this harness retainer now mobile, continue to disconnect the various connectors on the front. Now I mentioned earlier that there's the wiring harness retainer clips that need to be popped out. They are so brittle that they just broke before I could even get to them. So try your best to take them out. If not, you can either use some zip ties or you can buy some replacements from Honda. Disconnect the front 3 fuel injectors. Now for the front valve cover, this top wiring harness runs along just by the oil filler cap, and then there's a couple connectors, one for the catalytic converter's O2 sensor, if you guys can see that down there, and another one that looks like it's connected to some orange cable of some sort that I couldn't tell you what it's for, but feel free to disconnect those as well to allow you to swing the harness out of the way. With the front harness disconnected, you should be able to just swing it out of the way like so. We're going to remove the dipstick from the valve cover and then undo the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 10mm valve cover retaining bolts. And so once we've removed their bolts, give it a few wraps, break the seal loose, and remove the valve cover from the cylinder head. Easiest way to remove them is to drive a flat blade screwdriver just on the edge of the seal down with a mallet. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to bend the ring that these seals are made from. See, there's a ring in there. It's actually metal. Repeat the same. And it's a good idea, by the way, to put your valve cover onto a wood block just so you don't damage it, because it is aluminum. Now you want to make sure that prior to reinstallation that you use a shop rag or some paper towels and clean out the bores in which these seals will go into. If you have any nicks or burrs on the inside, you can take a tiny bit of fine sandpaper just to smooth them down, but luckily they came out perfectly. We've got our new seals here. I'm taking a tiny bit of engine oil. We're going to lubricate the inside of the bores and then also lubricate the edges of our seals. Using a 29 or a 30 millimeter socket, which is the same size as the seal, we're going to place them squarely into the hole as best as we can. And then we're going to use the socket and just tap them in until they're flush. Now it is important to note that we're not driving it in this way, we're actually driving it this way. So the seal's got to be facing you. So our valve cover bolts come with new grommets in the gasket kit. And so the easiest way to get the old ones off, because they're all hardened and all leaky and gross, is that you're going to separate the rubber from the metal hat, and then you're going to use a pair of side cutters, and then we're just going to cut them right off. Like so. And then when you do that, they just come right off, and then the metal ring slides off. Well, the challenge now is to put the new seals onto the bolts, because it can be quite tight. And so I found that the easiest way to do this is, because if you look here, that flange part of that bolt doesn't go in so easily. And you find yourself a socket, like a 17 mil or something, that this can sit on top of. And then you're going to put the bolt on top. And then to prevent damage to the head, we're going to take a 10 millimeter socket and we're just going to tap using our mallet, or hammer I should say, until that passes through that rubber piece. So one thing I'm going to mention here is that on the 5 valve cover securing bolts, that there is 4 long ones and 1 short one. And the short one's really easy because you can see exactly where it goes. Top dead center, because it's so shallow. The other ones require long ones. So if you're screwing them in and you notice that it's protruding and it's already tight, odds are you got them in the wrong spot. So very much like how we did the front valve cover gasket, we're going to undo the rear one now. So there's a series of bolts here. There's at least 3 on the front, and odds are 2 on that back side. So the removal process is exactly the same, and just make sure you pay attention to the lengths of the bolts that you are removing. Now, before we're able to remove the rear engine valve cover, there's a couple more odds and ends that need to come off to make your removal process easier. Right here on the side of the rear timing cover, you want to pop this wiring harness out of the holder. There's like a groove here on the side, and this has got to come out. And then this power steering hose right here. Actually behind here, you guys can see that there's actually a bracket right here with that bolt. That's got to come out as well. Otherwise, if you undo everything, that you're going to be caught up on the power steering hose. So prior to reinstalling the rear bank cylinder head cover, or valve cover, I guess, we need to use some of this Permatex Ultra Gray, aka Honda Bond, and we need to apply it to this location right here and right here. Just apply a blob of it there, and then again, just a bit right here. And the reason why you need this is because of this transition point on the gasket that can result in some oil leaks. So it's pretty important to make sure that, I almost want to tell you to put a bit more than too little, just so that it seals properly. So just spread that out nicely. Okay, so I've got a little bit of liquid gasket here that I'm just going to remove with my little pick, taking care not to scratch the cylinder head, because that can result in leaking. I'm just going to remove this little tiny bit. All right, so here's the tricky part, guys. How do we get this in without messing up the gasket? So we're just gonna have to lift this up as high as we can get it. Pull up on this harness as best as you can. And it's a tight fit, guys. Okay, but making sure that you're not dislodging the gasket in any way. And you want to slide spark plug tube seals over where they need to belong. There we go. You can actually feel them kind of pop on, and then press the valve cover on firmly. And you should not have any major gapping of any sorts. But once it goes on, reinstall the valve cover bolts, torquing them to 8.7 foot-pounds, or really hand snug. So the 3 short ones go on the front facing you, and then the 2 long ones go on the back. Front bank, rear bank valve covers all reinstalled. Everything's torqued down to 8.7 foot-pounds. I just double checked to make sure that the gasket didn't pop out anywhere. I've also reattached both the front wiring harness, coil packs, fuel injectors, as well as the same for the back fuel injector rail, as well as the wiring harness, power steering hose bracket, ground, and I've reinstalled the power steering pump and the belt. Now, one real important thing here, guys, is that make sure your fuel injectors are plugged in firmly, and do not forget this important little connector right here. Okay, there's a little sensor right here that's by the fuel rail. That's got to get plugged back in, because once you put that intake manifold back on top, that it's not going to be something that's easy to plug back in. Make sure that the mating surfaces are perfectly clean. Use a bit of brake clean on a rag and clean that all up. No differently than with the intake manifold gasket above and below. Okay, so nuts and bolts loosely installed. Give the intake a wiggle, and then begin tightening the manifold down. When we install the upper intake manifold plenum assembly, there's actually a torque sequence. The nuts and bolts have to be 16 foot-pounds, and it will tell you exactly what to do. It's supposed to be tightened in 3 different steps, right, before you reinstall the top cover. So basically, we start with the center, and then we move our way. So center, bottom right, upper left, and so on. So I'll include a snapshot of this in the video so you guys can follow it. And that also applies to the top cover as well. There is a specific tightening sequence to ensure that even pressure is applied to the gasket and seals. Tighten the inside bolts to 16 foot-pounds, then tighten the top cover bolts to 8.7. And I'm using a snap-on torqueometer calibrated torque wrench. You guys can't use inexpensive torque wrenches when you're doing something with such low torque values. You really need to invest in something that has very high accuracy at low torque. So the next step now is to remove the old gasket from the intake for the throttle body, install a new one, and then just like how we installed the intake plenum, we're going to put a new gasket on and then reinstall the nuts and bolts and torque those to 16 foot-pounds as well in a staggered manner. All right, guys, so if you've gotten this far, you're doing pretty darn good. So, you know, we basically put the plenum on, we replaced the throttle body gasket, we made sure that we attached all the hoses, all the clamps, all the connectors on the back side, and then looking here at the front, making sure that they're all connected here, as well as the catalytic converter's O2 sensor and whatever orange wires at the bottom, and then zip tied back any bits and pieces that were dangling or where we broke some factory clips. I got a couple more hoses like this one to attach onto the valve cover, as well as installing the dipstick. But we're going to make sure that the throttle body is clean. There's a bit of dirt in there, so we're going to wipe that out before we fire things up. And then we're going to reinstall our intake air filter assembly, and then we should be good. Okay, so started up the car. It's been running now for about 5 minutes. Making sure that there's no oil pouring out inside the valve covers, and clearly that's not the case. And for those naysayers that say you can't reuse metal gaskets, well, obviously the engine is running just fine. And the dealership and myself have reused metal gaskets repeatedly without too much ill effect. And we're also looking at the dash to make sure that there's no idiot lights, like a check engine light or something that would come on. And of course there isn't any, so that's a good sign.